Hollywood has been trying to crack the Formula One code for decades, and most attempts have been about as successful as a Haas pit stop. But now, we've got Brad Pitt behind the wheel of what might be the most ambitious F1 movie ever made, and honestly, it's a lot more complicated than you'd think. Let me set the scene for you. We're talking about a movie that took over 2.5 years to make, cost Apple a fortune, and had actual F1 drivers scratching their heads. But here's the thing, sometimes the most controversial films end up being the most interesting ones. So what's this movie actually about? Brad Pitt plays Sonny Hayes, a 50-something former F1 driver who had his career destroyed by a horrific crash back in the 90s. Now, 3 decades later, he's basically become a racing nomad, showing up at different events, dominating the competition, and collecting paychecks. Think of him as the racing equivalent of a gunslinger in an old western. The movie kicks off at the Daytona 24 Hours, and let me tell you, they don't mess around with the opening. Hayes is driving for a team owner named Chip Hart, played by Shea Wiggum, and he makes up serious time to put his team in first place during his stint. Right from the start, you can tell this isn't going to be your typical racing movie. But here's where things get interesting. The film is directed by Joseph Kosinski, the same guy who gave us Top Gun Maverick, and he's brought basically the same technical team with him. When you see those racing sequences, you'll understand why. The cinematographer Claudio Miranda has created some absolutely jaw-dropping shots that swirl around these neon-lit racetracks in towering IMAX scope. Add Hans Zimmer's electrifying score on top of that, and you've got something that genuinely gets your blood pumping. The central story revolves around Hayes getting pulled back into F1 by his old rival Ruben Cervantes, played by Javier Bardem. Cervantes now owns the Apex Grand Prix team, and they're having the worst season imaginable. They haven't placed in a single Grand Prix all year. The team's advisory board is ready to vote Cervantes out of his own operation, so he's desperate enough to try a Hail Mary, convince Hayes to come back after 30 years and maybe teach their hotshot rookie Joshua Pierce a thing or two about winning. Now, this is where the movie gets both brilliant and frustrating at the same time. On one hand, you've got all the classic sports movie elements you'd expect. There's the comeback story, the rivalry between the veteran and the rookie that eventually turns into mutual respect, an underdog team fighting for survival, and even a romantic subplot between Hayes and the team's technical director, Kate McKenna. But here's what's fascinating. The script written by Aaron Kruger deliberately downplays all of these traditional elements. As one reviewer put it, the motivations and stakes are never quite explicit enough to let you really pick sides or understand what's being contested while the drivers are out there racing. It's almost like they're trying to make a more realistic racing movie by avoiding the usual Hollywood cliches. And you know what? Against all odds, it actually works. This isn't Rush or Ford versus Ferrari, where you're getting these big dramatic character arcs. Instead, F1 does something none of those other racing films have done. It really digs into Formula One strategy. We're talking about choosing the perfect time for pit stops, intentionally causing minor crashes to give your teammate a well-timed safety car, and all those microscopic changes that can shave tenths of a second off a lap time. The film actually pauses for lengthy explanations about why the Apex drivers can change their tires, while other racers can't. Now, some people might find this boring, but here's the thing, it's actually pretty educational. One of the producers on this film is Lewis Hamilton himself, and dozens of real F1 drivers appear throughout the movie. In many ways, it resembles another Brad Pitt sports movie, Moneyball, which taught us all about complex baseball statistics, and how a guy with a spreadsheet can sometimes outthink a room full of gut instincts. But let's talk about the elephant in the room, the criticism. A lot of hardcore F1 fans are tearing this movie apart for being unrealistic. Brad Pitt is 61 years old in real life, and people are saying that's completely unrealistic for a modern F1 driver. But here's some perspective. Back in the 1950s, when the physical demands were less but the dangers were way greater, drivers like Felipe Tancelin and Louis Chiron were racing at 55, and Luigi Fagioli was winning races at 53. As for comebacks, sure, modern F1 comebacks usually happen after just a year or two away, but historically it's happened before. Dutch driver Jan Lammers raced from 1979 to 82, was out for more than a decade winning Le Mans and racing at Daytona, then came back in 1992. Italian driver Luca Badoer had 10 years between races before a short-lived comeback in 2009. When Brad Pitt was asked about drawing from history, he said something really interesting. We just drew from history. A little this, a little that, then we had Lewis Hamilton keep us straight. And Eddie Q, Apple's senior vice president who's also a Ferrari board member, told reporters that there's not a single event in the movie that hasn't happened in a real race. Now that doesn't mean these events could still happen today, but they served as inspiration. Take the movie's crash scenes for example. People are laughing at Joshua Pierce's incident at Monza, but there are elements that come from real life. In 2019, Formula 3 driver Alex Peroni had an airborne accident very similar to what we see in the film, and Romain Grosjean's 2020 Bahrain Grand Prix crash proved that F1 cars can still burst into flames in spectacular fashion. The movie even references the Crashgate scandal, when Nelson Piquet Jr. deliberately crashed at the 2008 Singapore Grand Prix to trigger a safety car that helped his teammate Fernando Alonso win. There's also a nod to drivers going from last to first in barely believable circumstances. The 2011 Canadian Grand Prix lasted more than 4 hours, had 6 safety car deployments, and was won by Jenson Button, who at one point was at the back of the field and had 2 collisions, including one with his own teammate Lewis Hamilton. But here's what I think is really smart about this movie. It treats other racing series with respect. When it comes to F1-focused media, there's often this tendency to act like Formula 1 is the only form of motorsport in the world that matters. Thankfully, this film doesn't fall into that trap. Hayes kicks off the movie by winning the Daytona 24 Hours, and the film ends with him heading off to Mexico to try the Baja 1000. Throughout the movie, there are references to Le Mans, Dakar, and other series. When Joshua Pierce faces the possibility of leaving F1, his manager suggests IndyCar as a viable alternative without treating it like some kind of downgrade. For a Hollywood film geared toward American audiences, this respectful treatment of American motorsport is actually pretty refreshing. Now let's address the big question. Who is this movie actually for? And here's where things get interesting. There are 6 compelling reasons why this film might be more successful than the critics are giving it credit for. First, the audio and visuals are absolutely impeccable. In many ways, this is the modern version of Steve McQueen's Le Mans. When McQueen set out to film that classic, he wanted to create a love letter to the most iconic endurance race in the world, and plot was a secondary concern. The storyline that connected the racing action was flimsy and cheesy, but those racing scenes earned the film its permanent place in motorsport movie history. F1 feels similar. The plot can feel clunky and loaded with Hollywood tropes, but the racing scenes are where it truly shines, and those are the scenes that will stand the test of time. Second, it's essentially a love letter to racing films. Whether you're a fan of Grand Prix, Le Mans, Days of Thunder, or even Talladega Nights, there's something in this new F1 film that feels like a callback to your favorite scenes. The poker scene is reminiscent of the sugar packet racing in Days of Thunder. The onboard shots are transformative in the same way Grand Prix were 60 years ago. The film is often funny, relying on stereotypes about European motorsport personnel, the same way Talladega Nights drew on NASCAR driver cliches. Third, and this might be controversial, but the movie is escapism, not reality. How often does Hollywood produce a completely accurate version of reality? Even theoretically factual racing movies like Rush, Ferrari, and Ford vs. Ferrari are packed with inaccuracies designed for entertainment. Movies are wish fulfillment. How many 60-year-old men wish they could race in F1? How many drivers in endurance races wish they could have epic battles with their competitors? These things don't really exist in real life, but they absolutely can exist in movies. Fourth, if you're willing to scratch beneath the surface, the movie actually pulls more from reality than you might think. Critics ask how a back-of-the-field team can suddenly start contending for podiums, but look at Alpine's performance turnaround in 2024, where the French team came alive near the end of the season. People wonder how Sonny Hayes can strategize for his teammate in the middle of a Grand Prix. But Fernando Alonso has done similar things for Lance Stroll at Aston Martin. Fifth, the movie thrives on technical excellence. The racing scenes are impressively authentic, shot during actual Grand Prix weekends with real teams and real drivers. The practical approach to filmmaking, inspired by those 60-year-old classics, creates a sense of authenticity that CGI simply can't match. But here's the sixth and most important point. This movie isn't made for hardcore F1 fans, and that's completely okay. Hardcore Formula 1 fans can be incredibly difficult to please. Just look at the endless debates about Max Verstappen's penalty points, whether America should have 3 Grand Prix, or if Lewis Hamilton deserves to be called the greatest of all time. There's never any consensus, even on the most basic topics. This film inhabits the same space as Netflix's Drive to Survive series. Both are compelling portrayals of the sport designed more for newcomers than for people who know F1 like the back of their hand. And honestly, that's great. F1 is growing around the world, particularly with younger and more diverse audiences, demographics that have historically been difficult for the sport to crack. For the first time in 75 years, Americans are flocking to F1 events, while young women have discovered new ways to engage